Is it time? Is it time to make a joyful noise? Why not? On Zoom and in person. Why not make a noise? Those of you coming in, be noisy. Say hello, wave. There you go. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Mankato, where our worship is entirely real and vital and as noisy as possible, and life-giving and life-sustaining in all times, including in these times. Everyone here today in person and on Zoom. Looks like there are a few people on Zoom. You are all welcome in this time we make sacred together. All are loved, worthy, and needed. Here you can bring your whole self. In these times and in all times, may we move into action to create the world of equity and liberation about which we dream. May we hold reverently and tenderly this one life, the here and now of which we are certain. We humbly acknowledge that before European colonization, the Dakota peoples were stewards of the land on which our fellowship building sits. They teach us that the land does not belong to any of us, though it holds the history of our conflicts and our attempts at reconciliation. And we commit to an ongoing and intentional journey of humble connection with Indigenous peoples, characterized by understanding our shared history, accepting responsibility for restoration, and building relationship in the here and now. Thus, we seek to be good relatives. I am the Reverend Rita Capizzi, humbled and honored to serve the holy as minister with this congregation. Sunday morning is a team effort, as you know. Thanks this morning to our greeter, Diane Dobitz, and thanks to our tech squad, Andy Roberts, and filling in, Sarah Cyphers. Our dear Kat Clements is sick, and we'll think about her later, but thank you, Sarah. And so today will be fraught with as many worries as possibly can be imagined, and that will be just fine. Dennis Cramblett is always also back there on hearing assist, and we thank Nancy Cramblett for live music this morning. We are very grateful to continue our offering of children's programming and thankful for the staff and volunteers that make these programs possible. Our child care provider, Carrie Johnson, and volunteer Deanne Nelson are already in the nursery. Alyssa Morrison joins our Director of Children's Faith Development, Macy Forsyth, for Children's Chapel and Youth Group later in the service. If you are new to the fellowship, we are grateful that you are expanding the we who is us. And we are grateful if you wish to share your contact information. There are forms online, there are forms in the pew, there are forms in the entryway. Fill them out as you wish. And we have hospitality in the fellowship hall today after service, thanks to Karen and John Knox and Molly and Joe Reinman. Just a reminder that there's a card in your pew with QR codes that with the help of your smartphone can take you to the order of service for today or to past orders of service where readings, links to music, and stories are also available. And there are codes also there to make a donation if you wish. Just a plug for our upcoming rummage sale. Keep saving those items you don't want anymore but think somebody else might be able to use. And contact Karen Knox or Linda Gansky for more information. And I don't see either of them in here now, but Karen Knox will be downstairs later. Look her up and she will help you with information. I also want to point out that on April 30th, that's next Sunday, there will be a fellowship luncheon, thanks to organizer Lee Gansky and the rest of the Hot Dish Brigade. So we can look forward to that luncheon next Sunday. Now I am pleased to welcome our guest preacher today. The Reverend Dr. Andrea Johnson is a Unitarian Universalist minister based in Minneapolis. She has recently completed her Doctor of Ministry degree at United Theological Seminary in St. Paul. Her dissertation responds to our UUA call, Widening the Circle, to articulate a theology of liberation, experimentation, and innovation grounded in our Unitarian Universalist principles and sources of inspiration. This This call is aimed at dismantling white supremacy culture within Unitarian Universalism and in our wider communities. Her dissertation offers 4 theological trajectories to ground racial justice work: the personalism of Martin Luther King Jr., empirical process theology, African American naturalistic humanism, and feminist liberation theology. So you will hear more about all of those when she is ready to give us her sermon. Andrea is deeply committed to racial justice work and serves her home congregation, First Universalist Church, in a variety of roles. She also serves on the Board of Trustees for United Seminary, where she is co-chairing a capital campaign and funding an endowed chair in world religions and intercultural studies. When she is not reading profound theology, she enjoys cooking, hiking, and spending time with her friends and family. Thank you for being here, Andrea. And now we ready ourselves for worship. And what is worship in a Unitarian Universalist context, especially if you think of worship as worshiping something or somebody, and you don't know what that something or somebody is? The word worship is from 2 Old English words, worth, worthy, and shapen, to shape. We worship in order to give shape to that which we deem worthy, that which has ultimate value. Hear now how member Tamara Stoffel defines worship. These are her words. Worship times are the rocks that I grip onto for refuge as I am splashing down testing and lonesome waters. When we breathe and sing together, I feel as one. When I hear the words directed at my soul, I am focused on our shared humanity, and I feel at ease. It is a place where my children will not be stared at or judged. It is the closest feeling of belonging my family has. We thank Tamara for her words. And so let us begin our worship. Together, let us kindle a flame symbolizing our co-creation of sacred space at home and in this place made sacred by years of love. As you do so, those on Zoom, please write in the chat that a chalice is lit on your street. You'll find a card in the pew that has our unison words. Please say them with me. We are a welcoming people of diverse beliefs who commit to nourish the spirit, broaden the mind, nurture the earth, and build community. May this flame we kindle remind us to strive today and every day to love beyond belief.
Well, good morning. It is a deep joy to be preaching here in Mankato and sharing worship with Reverend Dr. Rita Capizzi. As she shared with you in the introduction, I've been a UU for 20 years. My home congregation is First Universalist. I also served the Bloomington Fellowship for 3 years before leaving to complete my dissertation. I'm not sure if you read the title of it, so I'll tell you the title. It's Human Liberation, Sacred Nature, and the Inescapable Network of Mutuality, Unitarian Universalists' Quest to Dismantle White Supremacy. As an institutionalist, I care deeply about Unitarian Universalism and feel called to invest my time and energy to furthering its mission of building the beloved community we so long for. As I pursue this work and ministry, I describe my social location as someone who is white, heterosexual, married, temporarily able-bodied, middle-aged, and economically privileged. I was also raised in a liberal Christian denomination, the UCC, which has also shaped my theological formation. But most importantly, I bring my passion for liberal theology and racial justice to my ministerial calling as a congregational and public theologian. So by way of introduction, my dissertation seeks to do three things. Firstly, answer the question of why do racial justice work in religious community? Why not simply join a secular organization like SURGE or the Movement for Black Lives? As a minister, I believe there are deep theological reasons for doing this work in religious community. Secondly, as Rita mentioned, I'm responding to the Unitarian Universalist Association's important report, The Widening the Circle of Concern, which conducted an audit of white supremacy in our denomination. In the theological section in particular, the report argues that addressing the perennial problem of race in Unitarian Universalism has not been understood broadly as a theological mandate. We have not invested in developing the theological resources that could have allowed us to have a vocabulary of faith to meet the challenges of the 21st century. My dissertation addresses, and I hope will make a significant theological contribution toward rectifying this devastating critique. And finally, my dissertation seeks to respond to the mandate of the eighth principle of Unitarian Universalism, the call for each of us to be on a spiritual journey of wholeness, to build the beloved community and dismantle white supremacy culture. And again, I answered these important questions by offering 4 theological trajectories that Rita already said. And today I will focus on preaching on one of those trajectories, African American naturalistic humanism. I will do some comparing and contrasting of humanism with the personalist theology of Martin Luther King, but I want to make it explicitly clear that I'm not implying that humanism is better or supersedes King. They both can ground Unitarian Universalist justice work, and in this sermon I just intend to demonstrate how specifically African American naturalistic humanism can offer resources for theologically grounding our racial justice work. So with that introduction, I will now begin. So African American religious scholars Thomas Curry and Darius Hills ask this provocative question: what does it mean to proclaim that African Americans exist as more than a pigment of the white world's imagination? For King, it means to ground human worth and dignity theologically by proclaiming the value and preciousness of human beings to God. King declares that the basic thing about man is his dignity and worth to the Almighty God. Human beings have an inviolable worth because they are created, loved, and sustained by God. King often used the term somebodyness as a way of naming this sense of self-respect, self-worth, and dignity that Blacks were gaining as a result of their relentless, direct, nonviolent protests against racism and economic exploitation. African American naturalistic humanists, such as Carol Wayne White and Anthony Pinn, both acknowledge that the religious expression of Black Christianity has been used by African Americans to free themselves from dehumanizing depictions of their humanity and has supported their desire to achieve self-preservation, self-definition, and self-determination. Carol Wayne White unabashedly celebrates religious humanism also, and believes its major ideas have the potential to inspire a generation of scientifically oriented African Americans in search of newer, conceptually compelling views of religiosity that address a classic perennial question: what does it mean to be human and fully alive? While resting on different metaphysical assumptions from King, African American naturalistic humanism can also theologically ground human dignity and the racial justice work to which the eighth principle calls us. The description of human life and dignity that arises from Carol Wayne White's scientific analysis is, I quote, "The scientific epic becomes the starting point for positing an African American religious humanism constituted by a central tenet. Humans are relational processes of nature. In short, we are nature made aware of itself." White further explains that human animals become human destinies when we posit fundamental questions of value, meaning, and purpose to our existence. Our coming to be human destinies is structured by a crucial question: how do we come to terms with life? With other religious naturalists, White shares the sentiment that reveling in our sense of connectedness with other living beings can only be described as sacred. Even on a molecular level, she says, there is evidence to support the idea that in the very nature of life itself, there is some essential joining force. I find King's notion of somebodyness and his recognition of our fundamental interrelatedness resonant with White's description of sacred humanity. White's definition of sacred humanity is a way of naturalizing King's notion of somebodyness. As White explains, this orientation toward joining with others in establishing our common humanity is what I imagine when using the phrase sacred humanity. Humans are by our very constitution relational, and our wholeness occurs within a matrix of complex interconnectedness. In this context, our sacrality has fundamentally to do with ways of conjoining with others that transform us. It's important to note that White does not use the term sacred to connote something that is grounded in a supernatural reality or transcendent order. Rather, for White, the term sacred is imbued with a quality of ultimacy within the confines of what religious naturalism affirms, nature as the realm in which we move, live, and have our being. According to White, sacrality is a specific affirmation and appreciation of that which is fundamentally important in life, or that which is fundamentally valued, relational nature. Humans are interconnected parts and processes of nature, and our sacrality is a given part of nature's richness, spectacular complexity, and beauty. For White, this conception of the human as an emergent, interconnected life form amid spectacular diversity has far-reaching implications for African American culture. For White, sacred humanity is an apt descriptor of African Americans' intent on humanizing their existence in the face of dehumanizing gestures and tactics by dominant white culture. So you might be wondering, how does White's naming of African Americans as sacred humanity ground our racial justice work? What are the ethical fruits of African American naturalistic humanism? The first ethical fruit is that it culminates in declaring and celebrating humanity, specifically African American humanity, as sacred, despite persistent and dehumanizing anti-Black racism. By proclaiming and celebrating African Americans as human, as, quote, having the right to become our humanity, unquote, Unitarian Universalists contest and reject impoverished models of Black animality conceived by cultural spin doctors mesmerized by distorted racial constructs. With its naturalistic grounding, this expansive view of humanity urges UUs to challenge the most vile and viral constructions of isms rooted in problematic hierarchical and othering divisions. One example of how we UUs, and this congregation specifically, can cherish all forms of materiality as sacred and contest anti-Black racism is in our ongoing support or participation in Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism. Blue's mission is to harness love's power to combat oppression and foster healing as a spiritual and political imperative. In the 6 years since its founding, Blue has transformed from a small informal gathering of Black UUs into an impactful organization that creates life-giving and life-saving opportunities for spiritual community and Black-centered organizing. The ultimate goal of Blue is justice-making and liberation for Black people through our faith. Only when the most marginalized in our society are free, then we will all truly be free. I invite you to consider financially supporting or joining Blue to affirm the truth that only when Black lives matter, all lives truly matter. A second ethical fruit of African American naturalistic humanism can be found in the lesson from the myth of Sisyphus that we read earlier. In spite of any and all appearances to the contrary, King contended that because God is moral, there must also be a moral order to the universe that bends ultimately towards justice. King motivated his followers in the civil rights movement by encouraging them to trust and have faith in that ultimate trajectory. King's faith in a God that could still make a way out of no way formed the basis of his hope and trust in the moral outcome of the universe. Many Unitarian Universalists, along with African American naturalistic humanists, by contrast, argue or may argue that the moral arc of the universe may or may not bend toward justice on its own. But in the human realm, we can make an arc possible and expected by choosing an ethical directionality for our work in an ambiguous universe. So how might we as UUs find the motivation and hope to continue working for justice in this morally ambiguous universe we find ourselves in? Borrowing from Camus, Anthony Pinn wonders, is the proper response to ongoing oppression and racism suicide? If not, is there something, despite the absurdity involved, that we humans may grab hold of and anchor ourselves to, as to that which constitutes the reason that life should continue? Pinn explains that the myth of Sisyphus can represent both our private struggle as individuals as well as our need for community. The challenge to imagining Sisyphus happy can be grounded in an ethical stance that, quote, asks that we work to advance the potentialities of life for ourselves and others, despite the persistent, all too persistent sorrows in a world where many injustices are never acknowledged and much less remediated, and most victims die anonymously. As we continue to work, Pinn encourages us to locate success in the process. We maintain our justice efforts because we have the potential to affect change, and we must measure the value of our work not in terms of outcomes achieved, but in the process of struggle itself. More robust occupation of time and space is the norm. Perpetual rebellion is the process. Struggle, he says, is our last best option. Pinn also reminds us that we don't have to struggle alone. He encourages us to reject the noble individual who shoulders down and pushes only for themselves, an utterly miserable approach. Instead, humanism would do better through a turn to the individual within the context of community. Pushing that rock up the hill need not be a lonely and individualistic enterprise. We do the hard work of justice together in this community, while holding ourselves accountable to that community. In struggle, we find a new type of hope, one that is applicable to humanists working to turn punishment into possibility, angst into awareness, and repetition into resistance. We remain committed to work for justice by celebrating the sheer strength of human will, solidarity with our neighbor, and the integrity of our goals, despite knowing that these may not be enough to win the day. Echoing the Buddhist concept of non-attachment, I find Pinn's notion of finding contentment in the struggle itself actually quite liberating and downright hopeful, but because it encourages us to ground our work for justice in the present moment, despite no guaranteed outcome. When we renew our justice efforts, knowing that struggle is what we have to offer, UUs may experience a glimpse of the spiritual wholeness promised in the eighth principle. The process of struggle and the effort involved is the reward, so to speak. That is to say, struggle isn't a means to an end, rather it is what we have. It's what we can muster based on human potential and tendencies. Struggle then loses its negative connotation and instead marks out a positive push to the extent that it speaks to agency and regard for life over death-dealing policies and practices. So by interrogating human experience and human history, African American naturalistic humanists like Pinn and White find no rational basis for theism and instead mark out life meaning based solely on human accountability, responsibility, and potential. African American naturalistic humanism encourages UUs to acknowledge the sadness that may ensue from the loss of a transcendent intelligent power that ensures cosmic justice in some time beyond temporality. A divine observer who watches over us, whose interest, knowledge, and attentiveness gives our existence meaning and significance. and embrace the life and ethical fruits instead that African American naturalistic humanism makes possible. Humanist ethics and moral codes that value the web of life, of which humanity is a small part, and summons us to work to improve the arrangements of collective and individual life, without any sort of divine assistance. Even in the face of certain physical death, our common human destiny, humanist ethics invite Unitarian Universalists to act without appeal, to bring about meaning in a world defined by the absurdity of anti-Blackness and racial oppression. In the face of certain death and the failure of our most cherished hopes, including bringing an end to white supremacy, we as Unitarian Universalists commit ourselves to persevering in the struggle, mourning our losses and sorrows, yet holding to the audacity for joy. May it be said, and may it be so, and amen.
As we conclude our time of worship this morning, let us make a promise that we will remain committed to sustained and robust relationship with each other, to the vision of our faith community, to the values of Unitarian Universalism, and to the interdependent web holding us all. As Reverend Andrea extinguishes the chalice flame here, please extinguish your chalice at home and say the words with me, which are on your pew card. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Friends, please join in this final song together, words on your Zoom screen and on the pew cards. Thus we bless each other, and thus we are a blessing to each other.